Hi there, and welcome to this Mendix Malt how-to video. I'm your host for today, Nico. I'm a certified expert Mendix developer, and today we're discussing the Mendix Database Connector, so let's get into it. Alright, so the Mendix Database Connector is a very powerful tool to use, and what it basically does allow you to is to connect directly to the database without using the application layer security. So to find the Mendix Database Connector, what you can do is you can simply search in your Marketplace tab, database, and one of the first things that will pop up is this database connector in the Marketplace. So over here I have the tab, and you can simply just select download. What it will do is it will install the database connector module under your Marketplace modules, which is then available there. For today's demonstration, we are going to test it using two database types. We're going to use a PostgreSQL database, and we're also going to use a Microsoft SQL Server database. To give you an idea, what we have today is this little database, which I called persons, or my table is called persons, and inside the database I have some random data with a name, date of birth, a phone, email, address, and favorite food. So our goal today is to simply extract this data using the database connector. I have a similar or exactly the same data inside the PostgreSQL database, but we will get to that shortly. So the first things we're going to need is use three constants. Using the SQL Server database as an example, our first constant is our DB URL. As you can see over here, we are going to use JDBC to connect to our server. We say the server itself, the port number, as well as the database name. With Microsoft SQL Server, you can also use integrated security. More on that in a bit. So for now, we have a JDBC, SQL Server, localhost, and the port with the database name. The next part is we're going to need to set up our domain model. Now this domain model is very simple. As I don't really want to use the data in my app, it's only for display purposes, I'm going to use a non-persistable entity. In this case, our non-persistable entity's name is person, and I have all the data in it. Now the one thing to note here is that my naming convention of my attributes is lowercase. This is very important, as with the database connector, what I found was that the lowercase, it always pulls out the data in a lowercase format. Hence, that is very important because it actually matches, the matching is very case sensitive. I did try to extract it with a capital letter, but when I tried it, it did fail. The next part, what we're going to need to do is we need to create a microflow that we can query this data on. So what I did, I have a string variable in which I write my query. Now, what is very important here is that your query format is specific to the format of your database that you are using. As you will see here, I used the formatting of the syntax of a Microsoft SQL Server, and if I try to use this syntax in a PostgreSQL Server, that will not necessarily work. So, that being said, what I then do is I create a sample entity. Now, the sample entity is the entity into which I want to push the data. What kind of data type is this? And then I call this activity called execute query. Inside execute query, I define my username, my URL, my username, my password, as well as the SQL itself. And lastly, I give it a resultant object. That way, the activity knows what kind of output I will receive. In this case, our person list. So let's quickly see how this works. If I go to the default homepage, what I will do is I will quickly add a data grid, and I will select my source as a microflow, and using the SQL Server query sub microflow, I will automatically fill the data. For this case, I don't need to do server-side paging, and we will run it. Looking at our app now, you will see that it has indeed pulled through all the data from our database into our application. Nifty. Now, let's quickly hop back over and see the PostgreSQL. The PostgreSQL is very similar. What you will see here is that its JDBC for a local connection is very much simplified. So we have a JDBC, PostgreSQL, Mendix, Malt, and that assumes the default port of 5432. Again, we have a password and username constants. And with our subflow, what we will see with our query is we now use a PostgreSQL syntax. So very much, as you can see here, although I have my items here as capital letters, it still matches, it still changes it to lowercase, and we will still again create a sample entity, and again we use the execute query. In this case, I use the PostgreSQL constant, the username constant, and the password constant. Again, we pass in the SQL query itself as well as the person or our sample object. So if we quickly go over to our page and we change this query to the PostgreSQL query, and I say OK, and we run it again. Looking at our homepage again, we will see that we can get all the data we want. All right, so remember earlier that I told you that with Microsoft SQL Server, you can also use the integrated security. Let's take a quick look at that. So what you will see with my SQL Server database URL is that I can add this key value pair to use integrated security equals true. If I paste it over here in my default value, and I go over to my SQL Server database, because I'm now using integrated security, I no longer need to specify the username or password. All right, we say OK, and we go back to our home page, and we are changing this data source again to the SQL query activate flow. Let's quickly run that again. And while we're waiting for that, let's quickly hop over to this part. I believe we are still waiting for it to run. And there we go. There it ran using integrated security. So, in conclusion, using this database connector is a great way to extract data from external databases, but there are some things you need to take into consideration. First of all, these external databases are no longer underneath your application security level. That means you need to enforce the security yourself, whether it is by specifying user roles on your database, or whether it is to ensure that whoever has access to the functions has the proper permissions. Also, you need to take into consideration that using the database connector, you can execute any SQL query. That includes deletes, updates, and reads, even creates. Lastly, the database connector is way more powerful than what we just displayed here. You can even use it to execute functions, but more than that in a later video. For now, that is all we have for you today. We hope you had a good time and you can use the database connector more effectively. Cheers, guys.